Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Gilhooly. So today's event is being delivered by the National Planning Hub, which is based in and led by the Scottish Government. And we work in partnership with the Improvement Service to do what we do. So in the past year, we've offered a flexible approach to providing additional search capacity and expertise and brokerage support and professional capacity and efficiency in practice to planning authorities around Scotland. I'm one of the policy officials in that Scottish Government team as well. So in the context of today's event on data centres, we recognise that planning is a really essential activity that supports Scotland to establish itself as an attractive location for green data centres and to accelerate inward investment from the data centre sector. So this event's been designed to support you with topical insight to navigate this area of inward investment. And as it's been referenced today, I'm really delighted that we've got three presenters with us today. So we have Michael Hunter from Apertura, and Michael is the head of commercial there and responsible for establishing a portfolio of new data center sites powered by renewable energy in the UK, for use by hyperscalers and data center operators. And then also joining him will be Fraser Blackwood, who's the head of planning at Apertura. And then, as you heard, presenting today also will be Susanna Sebastian, a senior policy officer from SEPA. So the speakers today are going to help you learn more about what a data center is. And for those involved in the planning process, we'll start to really kind of delve into things that will help you in your role. When it comes to the Q&A at the end, we'll also welcome Marcus Fair, who's Director of Land Development at Enra Partners, and they're an independent investor, developer and strategic advisor focused on enabling sustainable digital infrastructure within the real assets across the UK and Europe. And then also to welcome Jackie Lang, who many of you may know from SEPA, to that Q&A. The main thing today is that each of our speakers have generously provided their time for us today, and obviously their attendance at this Planning Hub presentation is our wish to bring you great speakers who have the very latest insights on this strategic area of inward investment. So this is something that is being done outside of and without any prejudice to the formal moments that you may be working with folks on any planning applications. The other thing here is that this event is at an introductory level, and obviously glad so many of you could join. Very much looking forward to the questions that you drop into the chat. We're going to make sure that post the event, we use any questions that you provide as feedback to shape sort of further events and products that the National Planning Hub could deliver. So watch the space, there could be a lot more to follow. And obviously with so many attendees here today, I can't guarantee that we'll get to everyone at the Q&A, but we'll certainly try our very, very best. So I think, Andy, that's probably everything from me. I wonder if you would like to bring Fraser and Michael on first, please.
So firstly, good morning, everyone. I'm just watching that attendance ticker at the top increasing to almost 200. So really amazed by the numbers and really thankful that we can lift our heads up from the desk for an hour to discuss the emerging data center market. It's probably indicative where the industry is at the moment. It's going very quickly from relatively unknown, untested in planning terms in Scotland to a real core strand of national infrastructure, and it's moving at significant pace. And I'll introduce Mike in a second to talk you through the reasons behind that. I will say that Mike's also recently been on BBC's Scotcast talking about AI and growth zones. So for fans of that, I would definitely recommend looking back last week, a really insightful discussion on AI growth zones in the central belt of Scotland. So really the purpose of today from our perspective is to communicate our experience so far in the design and development phase of the DC portfolio that we intend to deploy across the central belt of Scotland. I'm really keen to spark some discussion on embedding some consistency in approach and how decision makers tackle these quite complex development types. I think it's fair to say that the planning landscape is overall supportive, but also fair to recognise that development not yet fully scrutinised through the planning process in Scotland, and policy is relatively immature in that sense. But in saying that, this is a really exciting opportunity for Scotland, and it's imperative that we all work together to try and realise that. So just very briefly, an introduction to myself. I'm head of planning at Apertura. Started my career at local authority, development management, and also a number of years at SEPA. I've since spent a number of years in the consultancy side, both with AECOM and Jones Lang LaSalle. And over the past 2 years, I've worked in the development side, most recently in renewable energy, and with Pacific Green on battery storage and Apertura. Joined Apertura in November time, at a really exciting time in the profile of the business as we look to extend our reach from originally battery storage and renewable energy into the data centre world. Just in terms of the agenda, so Mike will talk you through the data centre market opportunity in Scotland and his experience so far, and then keen to just touch on some of the key policies, both at national and local level, and really kind of get under the skin of what these things look like and perform like in the environmental footprint of data centres, in order hopefully to spark some debate about how we approach these in the planning process. So Andy, if I could ask you to flip back to Mike and he can take you through the initial slides.
Super. Thanks, Fraser. So good morning, everyone. I am Michael Hunter. I'm head of commercial at Apertura. I've spent the last 15 years working in the data center sector, so for companies the likes of CBRE and Deloitte. Before joining Apertura at the tail end of 2024, I worked for Google for 5 years as part of their energy location strategy team, helping identify where across APAC and EMEA were the most strategic locations to deploy their data center portfolio. I really welcome the opportunity to speak to everyone this morning. I think this sector is often very misunderstood, and to Fraser's opening points, it's moving very, very quickly. I think the 3 key messages that I'd be really keen to leave everybody with at the end of my 10-15 minutes is firstly really to join the dots between what a data center is and how important they are to everything that we do. The second one is to provide some context around where the market in the UK has come from and where we believe it's heading. And the third topic is then to introduce some strategic considerations about why Scotland's well placed to benefit from data centres going forward. So just kicking off, just to provide you a bit of context around Apertura, we're one of the biggest renewable energy portfolios in Scotland. The portfolio is largely split into 2 components. So one is the battery energy storage portfolio. We have around 2.2 gigawatts of consented BESS projects. They're obviously there to help meet net zero and the 2030 targets that the government have set. Separately to that BESS portfolio is what we're here to talk about today. And what we also have is 2.3 gigawatts of demand connections, which have been identified as suitable data centre sites. Those sites are all in Scotland, and the majority of which are focused around the central belt of Scotland. Apertura's role within this data centre portfolio is really to remove the barriers, to buy down lead time and ensure that hyperscalers and data centre operators can provide the digital infrastructure that we're all using. To do that, there's 3 key components that we focus on. So one is power. Access to large, scalable, renewable power sources is what all these hyperscalers are looking for. And that search is on just now at a global level. The second piece is we need to, as Apertura, identify suitably sized land, free from risk factors, in close proximity to where that power is, to where our grid connections are. Our strategy today has very much to focus on brownfield sites or master plan sites wherever possible. And the third key strand, obviously, is where most of the focus, I think, today will be is around planning. and really looking to mitigate that planning risk to allow hyperscalers and operators to come in and invest. Fraser, if we could go to the next slide, it'd be great. So from discussions with friends, family in Scotland, I've really noticed there continues to be a massive disconnect between what a data center is and how important they are to everything that we do. So, I mean, if we start with that question of what a data center is, I think the answer is actually a bit stale and a bit boring. A data center is essentially a secure warehouse. It's connected to a large amount of power. There's fiber optics cables that need to come into it, and it's essentially full of servers. I think the much more interesting question is then actually, what does a data center do for me? I don't think it's too dramatic to say that these facilities are essentially running the internet. There's this perception that the cloud is somewhere up in the ether, when the reality is it's actually a collection of physical servers that are actually sitting in these buildings. I think where my head's actually going now when trying to describe what these facilities do is actually it's potentially easier to think about what you can do without a data center. So I would encourage you all, if ever you're struggling or struggling to describe what a data center does, is to think about what can your laptop do if you disable the Wi-Fi, or on your phone if you switch it to airplane mode. What can you actually then utilize of that technology? From a work perspective, it would mean certainly we wouldn't be able to have this Teams call. There'd be no ability to collaborate on open docs. There'd be no emails, no HR systems, no payroll services. Everything would be down. From a personal perspective, there'd be no banking, no social media, no Uber, no Spotify, no iPlayer. All of these services that we're using, both from a work perspective, from a personal perspective, are all fundamentally going through these data center facilities. Next slide, please, Fraser. So the second point that I wanted to make was to provide some context around where the market in the UK has come from and where it's heading. I think certainly back to my last point in relation to the products and the services that we are ultimately all using. Another question that I get a lot is, we're using all these services on a day-to-day basis. Why do we even need more of these facilities? And I think this context of where we've come from and where we're going is then really helpful. So worth saying that the sector's the sector is really only 25, 30 years old. So back in the early 2000s, if for anybody that was working in that time, you can cast your mind back. You'll remember, if you were utilizing a computer at that time, the computer would sit underneath your desk. And if you wanted to send an email, if you wanted to work on a Word document, you had to physically be sitting at your computer. I think it's really worth everybody reminding themselves of that context. At that time, from a data center perspective, the majority of the corporate use was coming from financial services, and they were running those services, those servers, from their office buildings themselves. So there wasn't a huge need, certainly from a planning perspective, to be thinking about these unique assets. That all changed throughout the 2010s when financial services started to outsource their servers, outsource their compute to specialist facilities, which was in part driven by 9/11. Banks started to get really worried, about the potential terrorist attacks and the impact of their computer systems in offices if that was going to be a continuing trend. So from a UK perspective, it meant that all these servers were moved out of offices into specialist facilities that had to be close enough to the City of London for speed, for latency perspective, but close enough. So it had to be far enough away from a resilience perspective, redundancy perspective, but close enough from a speed and latency perspective. And what we then saw is the emergence of the data center market in and around the M25, very much anchored on Slough in particular. And that's really where the market has continued to grow from a UK perspective. Much of that growth happened throughout 2015 onwards with the advent of cloud computing. Again, I think it's these technologies that we're all using every day in our lives that we now completely take for granted. But cast your mind back 10 years ago when Google, when Microsoft, when Amazon Web Services were all deploying cloud computing. They then anchored in on the facilities that had been established by the financial service sector. And it meant, or has meant, that over the last 10 years, we've seen London, Slough, other locations around the M25 really develop from a data center perspective, and means that London now holds one of the largest data center markets in Europe. But there was no strategy to that growth. There was no strategy to where these facilities were going to be. And there was certainly no strategy around the land and the power that would be needed in the future. And that's really where we've got to now in the 2020s with the rise of AI products like ChatGPT, Gemini, with all this AI capability that's being folded into our everyday use. We need more and more data centers. The traditional locations in and around the M25 are massively constrained from both a land and a power perspective. And we now really need to be thinking more strategically from a whole system perspective around where these facilities should be located. Next slide, please, Fraser. So it's really with that context that I want to leave you with my kind of final point around the strategic thinking that we need to be undertaking is, and why Scotland's really well placed to benefit from data center growth and the investment that comes with them. So it's clear that until recently there really wasn't demand for this type of services. There wasn't demand for facilities to be out with the M25. But that started to change, both because of the scarcity of land and power down in the southeast, and also because of the types of products and services that these hyperscalers are running from an AI perspective. They have more flexibility in relation to the location and where these facilities can be deployed. The key aspects from data center development, and really where Scotland starts to play in, energy is obviously the big one. So these facilities do need huge amounts of electricity, and Scotland is very well placed to meet that. You know, we've got access to large, scalable, renewable energy that hyperscalers are scouring the globe to try and find. They're really now coming at their location strategy from a power first perspective. And Scotland's very, very well placed to meet it with excess renewable energy that's being produced every year. From a land perspective, I think it's really easy to kind of look at land as the easy part, but actually it's much more nuanced. I mean, not only are we looking for large scale sized land, you know, in our portfolio, we have a minimum threshold of 50 acres. That 50 acres has to be risk-free of potential risk factors, as well as close to the grid connections that we have. And I think importantly, the piece that is often overlooked is then in close proximity to a skilled workforce that can actually come in and operate these facilities. So it does, I think, from a Scotland perspective, then really mean that from the initial developments that are likely to come, it will be a kind of central belt focus. I don't see the first wave of facilities being in more remote locations, largely due to that workforce piece. I think from an Aperture perspective, when you lay on all of those requirements, it then means that, you know, we're looking at previously developed brownfield sites or strategic master planned areas. The likes of Ravenscraig, Freeport, Glenbervie and Westerhill are all within our portfolio. I think the last point in relation to Scotland and UK more generally is then the government support, and it's great to see, you know, almost 200 people on this call today interested in the sector, interested in terms of the implications of the sector. The UK government launched their AI action plan at the start of 2025, and as part of that, there's a specific initiative with the AI growth zone. You might have seen that last week, Lanarkshire was announced as the first Scottish AI growth zone. I think it's great to see this combined thinking around back to we need to be strategic around trying to incentivize large-scale demand where there is excess renewable energy. Typically, that is Scotland. One of the biggest benefits of being within an AI growth zone is Scotland then, if you're in the growth zone in Scotland, you then benefit from the largest discount on an OPEX perspective on your utility power. So it's great to see that combined thinking from government to incentivize this large-scale demand, large-scale investment into places like Scotland where there is this excess renewable power. So back to my opening objectives. So hoping that I've been able to kind of join some of those dots between what a data center is and how important they are to everything we do. Hopefully you've understood a bit more around the context of where these facilities have come from, where they're located in the UK just now, why Scotland now plays into being a strategic location going forward, and then understood really in some real specifics as to, from a land perspective, from a power perspective, and from a talented and skilled labour pool, why Scotland is very well placed to benefit from the investment in this sector then going forward. So with that, I'll hand back over to Fraser, who'll go through some of the more specifics on a planning perspective.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that intro, Mike. Really useful. And just to pick up on that Slough example that you talked about, so there's some really good case study work on how that became what it is now. In the late 90s, early noughties, the regional council made that a simplified planning zone, which really established a pre-approved framework for this type of development in that industrial area. So decisions came in kind of weeks rather than months and years, and led to this cluster effect, which attracted shared resources, employment opportunities. So a real success story. I think something like £30 million in rates per year to the local council, and literally tens of thousands of jobs. So a good blueprint that's worth noting. So as Mike said, we're close to approaching the planning applications for our data centre portfolio in Scotland. I don't necessarily have any answers here about policy, but I'm keen to explain our experience and maybe open up some questions about how we all collectively approached some of the policy challenges around this sector. A good place to start, I think, is NPF 4. As I'm sure everyone knows, Scotland's spatial strategy and forms part of the development plan. Of the 18 national developments in there, number 12 relates to digital fibre networks, and hidden at the bottom of that is support and principle for green data centres. More of that later. What else we can glean from that? National Development 12 is that the greenhouse gas narrative expects the impact of greenhouse gases to be negligible as a result of the deployment of data centres. So that gives us a clue as to what a green data centre might be. Also in NPF4, it's clear to see that data centres are considered essential infrastructure, and that brings us in line somewhat with our colleagues down south who in 2024 established data centres as critical national infrastructure. And as with Mike's point earlier on, it really is a direction of travel that data centres are underpinning almost all economic activity and infrastructure across the UK. I think in England now you can also opt into the National Strategic Infrastructure Project regime. So their direction of travel is moving away slightly from kind of fragmented local decision making into nationally consistent tests on these types of developments. So site selection and interaction with local development plans. I'm not aware of any local development plans that specifically reference data centres. I might be corrected on that, but they sit fairly comfortably within that use class 4, 5 and 6. Use class isn't necessarily established, but in terms of employment and the function of these things, that would be the most sensible. As Mike said, there is some quite critical locational challenges. They're big, so they need a lot of land. It needs to be close to a skilled workforce. It needs to be close to the point of use to avoid that latency, and it needs to be close to power. So with that essential infrastructure established in NPF4, I wouldn't be surprised to see, greenbelt being tested, as we've seen with the likes of battery energy storage, where we are really restricted to proximity to power, and more seeing that kind of almost sequential test of land availability. In terms of EIA, we've probably screened maybe 10 sites across Scotland, all of different sizes, obviously all in different receiving environments. The vast majority have been screened negatively. For those that haven't, and where EIA is required, almost exclusively the focus has been on water, air and greenhouse gases. So more and more, as we're seeing challenges from third parties in that EIA screening process, I expect that will become more and more robust as the sector develops. And lastly, this link to energy net generation. So almost all of our sites that we're looking to deliver have associated battery energy storage with them. As Mike said, these facilities are power hungry, so that battery energy storage system allows that kind of fluctuation in power demand to be smoothed out. Of course, anything over 50 megawatts in terms of generation is consented slightly differently through the Electricity Act. So there's a conflict there about how we judge these and if they're coming forward together in terms of phasing. And we talk about cumulative impacts. How do we assess these as one development? And again, looking back at the English example, looking at that NSIP regime, you can now look to do generation and data centre as part of one planning application package. So back to the question of what's a green data centre. There was a question asked in Parliament just before Christmas, and Minister Ivan McKee answered by saying that it's for planning authorities to decide what a green data centre is, but he did hint at the fact that there are some critical factors that need to be considered in that judgment. And if you look at this slide, if we're talking green data centres, what he mentioned was really kind of 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So how is the data centre powered? What energy efficient technologies does it look to deploy? What is the water usage? And what is the opportunity for reuse excess heat? Now, they're all critical factors. I would add biodiversity enhancement into that. These are big sites with plenty of opportunity to deliver really serious biodiversity enhancement as part of the land parcel. And I think all this needs to be framed under what the socioeconomic benefits are. So I'm going to come back to these points, but in relation to specifically one of our projects. So this is one parcel of one of our projects at Ravenscraig, which we are seeking to go into planning very soon with, just to give you an overview of what these things look like. So this is one parcel of a wider campus, so the actual site is almost double the size of this. This site itself is about 100 acres. You can see it's largely similar to industrial or storage and distribution type of development, albeit that it's big. And if we move from left to right on the screen, so 6 data center buildings, each of these require up to kind of 50 megawatts of power, around 20,000 square meters in terms of footprint, and 2 stories, so around 25 meters in height. And you can see the flows from the backup generation, which is kind of 28 meters in height. And then just in here is the battery storage backup power, which again, consented slightly differently. So really interesting debate as to how we consider these as a whole development. And then in the extreme right is the substation, which brings down the power from the network. So going back to our consideration of what's a green data center. Renewable energy sources. So as Mike said, the vast majority of electricity in Scotland is already from renewable sources. I think there's something like 70 gigawatts in the pipeline. So this is actually what's making it an attractive proposition for global investors, because they all have very strict ESG targets and they want to ensure that they are producing clean power. I think the government are quite keen to increase the demand. I think almost £390 million of constraints payments to onshore wind farm developers in 2024, and only increasing. If we can increase the demand and get that energy off the grid and into the data centres, then it has a genuine impact on taxpayer money, which again, Scottish Government are really cognisant of. In terms of energy efficient technologies, I don't think that's a difficult policy bar to reach. All these are highly technical, thermal efficiency, heating and cooling, on-site renewables, and again, a lot of that's driven by the market and corporate ESG objectives. Water usage, I think, is one where there's been a lot of misinformation across the sector, primarily based on US examples, which completely different systems, completely different environment, completely different regulatory regime. In terms of that example I showed, we're talking about 5,000 to 6,000 cubic meters of water as an initial fill to cool the systems, which is kind of 2 swimming pools. And then beyond that, it's only really the office domestic use, which is required. So a lot of misinformation there, which has received a lot of attention. In terms of heat networks, I think this is something that's a massive opportunity, especially in those master plan sites where the data centre is acting as an anchor for future development. There is obviously a hierarchy of difficulty in terms of producing heat networks which are efficient. It's really difficult to retrofit, but if we're looking at significant customers like hospitals or universities or future housing, then it's absolutely a massive opportunity that needs to be captured. And then going back to the socioeconomic benefits, again, just looking at that specific site at Ravenscraig, 3.9 billion total capital investment, lots of high numbers there, which really move the dial in terms of how these things can contribute to the Scottish economy. So, conscious of time, in summary, I think it's clear there's a direction of travel here. The government wants more capacity, faster in more places, but that can't come at any cost, and these facilities need to be sustainable and they need to have significant local benefit. Obviously, location is critical, and Scotland as a nation is ideal, but we need to be cognizant about how that fits in terms of land use policy. Speed and certainty in policy, also really important. Feels at the moment there's almost a 2-step solution here. First, demonstrating that you've got a green data centre and therefore comply with NPF4, and then demonstrating that it's acceptable in terms of development plan policy. I think the heat reuse opportunity is super important, and we're speaking to a number of operators and the likes of Scottish Enterprise about how we really maximise that benefit. Community engagement and benefits, something that we could probably have a whole hour on at some point in the future, but interesting to see whether we start to look at a kind of per megawatt rate, which is similar to the onshore wind regime in Scotland. And then environmental stewardship and innovative power solutions. I think more and more power is going to become critical. So can we look to utilise private purchase agreements from onshore wind, solar and battery directly into these facilities to relieve the network and the grid? So hopefully that sets the scene, and keen to get into both SEPA's presentation and the Q&A.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, my name is Susanna Sebastian. I'm a Senior Policy Officer in SEPA. First of all, thank you for inviting us to provide a brief introduction on our regulatory remit for data centers. A data center might be subject to multiple environmental regulation regimes, depending on its specific design and operation. This table identifies the regimes associated with our main site activities, beginning with on-site combustion of fuels for energy generation, which are activities regulated under the Environmental Authorization Scotland Regulations, ESAR. The level of authorization will depend on their thermal input and apply to both backup and embedded generation. On-site combustion leads to greenhouse emissions, which will be covered by the Emissions Trading Scheme, ETS, if the total rated thermal input for all stationary combustion units of above 3 megawatts thermal individually exceeds 20 megawatts thermal in total. In addition, an air emission risk assessment is required to assess their air quality impact. Data centers are energy intensive, primarily because of the cooling demands needed to maintain their functionality. So they might require compliance with the Energy Savings Opportunities Scheme, ESOS, which is a mandatory energy assessment scheme for organisations in the UK that are regarded as a large undertaking based on number of employees and annual turnover. If an organisation is part of a corporate group, the highest UK parent usually takes responsibility for ensuring group-wide compliance. Data centers might also incorporate battery energy storage systems, BESS, which are subject to a number of environmental regulations and require fire prevention and incident management. Then, depending on the cooling systems used, water abstractions outside the public water supply might be undertaken, and these activities are regulated by SEPA under ESAR, and the level of authorization will depend on the volume of water abstracted. Pre-application discussions are recommended to ensure sufficient water is available throughout the year, including periods of water scarcity. Water discharges from cooling systems would be considered trade effluents and require an ESAR authorization. Fuels and chemicals likely to be stored at data centers might fall under the control of major accidents hazards regulations, if the quantities stored exceed the thresholds identified in the regulations. Data centers might also use fluorinated gases, F-gases, in cooling systems. If this is the case, the site needs to comply with F-gas regulations, which include a number of obligations such as keeping an F-gas register, conducting leaks checks by F-gas certified personnel, and keeping required records. Finally, electrical equipment such as IT equipment used in data centers is in the scope of the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Regulations, and we have produced a comprehensive guidance providing electrical equipment users further details at their responsibilities under these regulations. As you can see, the table has hyperlinks with further information pages for all the regulations I mentioned. But also, you can also contact me here for any further questions. And we also plan to publish a dedicated webpage with more information, which should be live by the next month, hopefully. Thank you.